Yuji and Sukuna's binding vow is one of the most important moments in all of JJK. But what if it had been just a little bit different? Let's talk about it, but spoilers beware. I'm of course referring to the Enchain Binding Vow, the agreement that Yuji and Sukuna made where Sukuna would resurrect Yuji, but in return, he would at some point in the future get 1 minute in control of the body. But importantly, he agreed that he wouldn't hurt anyone during that 1 minute. Now, as we know, that binding vow was set at the beginning of the story, but Sukuna wouldn't invoke it until about 200 chapters later when he finally said in chain and took over for that 1 minute in order to swap hosts from Yuji to Megami. However, there was one part of this that Sukuna couldn't account for, and that was whether or not Yuji included himself when he said that Sukuna could not harm anyone while he was in control of the body, which is why Sukuna says, however, from here on is a gamble, as he goes on to convert himself into a cursed object and then rip that finger off and feed it to Megami. So ripping Yuji's finger off could be considered harming someone within that 1 minute. However, as he finds out, it doesn't break the binding vow because Yuji did not include himself. Now, some people call that a cop-out, but personally, I actually really like that element to this scene because it just speaks to Yuji's character to me. You know, he's always very empathetic, always thinking about others. It just rings true to me that he wouldn't have even considered himself when making that vow. However, what I will say is kind of a weird cop-out is what happened with Angel here, because yeah, he didn't kill her or, cause her like a grievous physical injury or anything, but he did knock her out. But so anyways, the question here comes from General today, and he says, what would the story be like if Yuji had included himself in that binding vow? Meaning Sukuna wouldn't have been able to harm him either, meaning he couldn't have done the cursed object ripped off the pinky thing. And that's an interesting question, right? Because that means that this cannot happen, at least not the same way we saw it, right? And this essentially is Sukuna's entire motivating force throughout the beginning of the story. He does not want to be imprisoned in Yuji anymore. So I think we have to go far back further than this moment to see how that ripple effect would happen. Because honestly, if Yuji adds that stipulation, then this vow just might not ever happen in the first place, right? Because Sukuna only did this because he foresaw a way for him to get something out of it. He understood that loophole of potentially swapping to another body. And at this point, he had already first seen that spark within Megami. So whether or not he'd already decided, like, I'm going in Megami, like that's the for sure plan, he was cooking that up, right? So if Yuji specified, you can't even hurt me, then Sukuna might realize, okay, there's no way to do that version of the plan I wanted. So either this vow might entirely change to create some other sort of loophole, or he might accept it and just try to think of a new loophole to still accomplish what he needs. Devil's advocate, we even saw in this situation, he was willing to risk breaking that binding vow because he didn't know whether or not this would work, right? So even if he did say he wouldn't have harmed Yuji, it might have played out exactly the same, and maybe this wouldn't have been considered harm, right? Now, obviously, ripping off somebody's finger isn't doing them a favor, but it might have just been a similar case of, well, let's see, like I'm just converting myself to a cursed object and transferring to somebody. Like, this is part of the natural process. Maybe it won't count in the same way that knocking out Angel didn't count for whatever reason, right? Now, that's kind of a cop-out because in this scenario, nothing changes, but it might have been just something he tried with nothing else to lose. Realistically, though, I think that entire sequence has to change. And instead of the Enchain Binding Vow being how Sukuna transfers bodies, he might force Yuji into a different binding vow based upon other circumstances. And Exhibit A would be this moment right here, which was constructed by Mahito for that very purpose. At this point in the story, Mahito didn't know that Sukuna and Yuji already had a binding vow. They didn't know that Sukuna already had his own plan for escaping, right? But this situation with Junpei was built so that Yuji would be forced into a corner and forced to accept a binding vow that gave Sukuna control. So if there was this situation where Sukuna either didn't make the vow with Yuji yet, or he made that worse one, he might have just capitalized on this and been like, yeah, you know what? I can heal Junpei. Let's make a binding vow. And this time you remove your restrictions. Now, could he have healed Junpei? Probably not, because of how idle transfiguration works. So, how the vow would have been constructed, we would have had to see. But basically, whether in this situation or some other one, like maybe during Shibuya when things went crazy, Sukuna could have just forced Yuji into a deal that more so fit his standards. And then honestly, a third option could be that Sukuna just lets Yuji die here. Like if Yuji adds that stipulation and Sukuna realizes he won't be able to do what he wants to, he might say no, and we'll just die. Because at this point, Yuji only had two, I guess technically three, if you want to think about it that way, fingers at this point, and Sukuna might have been chill with just letting 3/20ths of him die. There are plenty of other fingers out there. He's always been the strongest. He's not really threatened by anyone, especially not at this point in the story, right? So that might have been like, cool, you were a prison for me anyway. I've been waiting 1,000 years. I'll wait 1,000 more if that's what it takes. I'm not making this deal unless you agree to my terms. But yeah, ultimately, I don't think much changes in the grand scheme because Yuji was never in a power position to negotiate with Sukuna, right? Either he's just going to let him die or he's just going to force him into a corner to make that deal he needs later on anyway. Like Sukuna and Kenjaku were always the ones pulling the strings here.